Welcome to the Gab Lab, a show where we tinker with titillating topics and explore the effulgent excellence of existence. We cover a wide range of subjects that are sure to intrigue you, so stick around and stay curious.
Gab Lab.
Welcome to another episode of the Gab Lab. I'm your host, Michael Wilson. In this episode, we'll be talking with Kevin Feeney, PhD, and author of the Fly Agaric Compendium. I really enjoyed this conversation with Kevin. It was fun to just riff on Amanita and different subjects. We covered a lot in this episode. I hope to have him on again to talk about mythology and lore, which is something that we didn't really talk about. We went over a lot of Amanita 101 stuff, how to pick them, how to dry them, how to prepare them, what the effects can be, what the microdoses and the macrodoses are like. If you have any interest in Amanita, I highly suggest listening to this whole podcast. It was a really fun conversation. Kevin Feeney, PhD, JD, is an author and researcher trained in the fields of law and cultural anthropology. His primary work, Fly Agaric, a compendium of history, pharmacology, mythology, and exploration, was published as an edited volume in 2020. His research and writings have been published in the International Journal of Drug Policy, Journal of Psychoactive Drugs, Human Organization, and Curare. He is a current member of Chacruna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants and also a member of the Board of Advisors for Psyched Wellness, a Canadian health supplements company specializing in medicinal mushrooms. Hello, Kevin. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on, and it's an honor to be interviewing you. And you wrote the Fly Agaric Compendium, which is kind of like the modern Amanita Bible. A lot of people refer to it as that. So I'm really excited to have this conversation.
All right, well, that's one of my favorite mushrooms to talk about, so I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just just to start it off, like, I guess what compels you with the Amanita Muscaria mushroom, and at what point did you decide, like, I'm gonna write this massive compendium about all things Amanita? Yeah, just curious about your origin with it.
Right. Yeah, well, I first became interested in Amanita muscaria as a teenager. Um, after having sort of my first psychedelic experiences and getting interested more in different plants and fungi that are out there that produce some of these experiences, and wanting to know more about them and figure out how to identify them. And I remember looking through mushroom books that we had at our house and looking up the psilocybes and all these pictures of little brown mushrooms, and I couldn't tell them apart from any other little brown mushroom in the book. So I wasn't very sure that I would be able to figure out how to identify those. But then I came across Amanita muscaria in the book, and of course it's just such a recognizable mushroom from you know from fairy tales, kids books, Super Mario Brothers, other things like that. And it seemed to me, well, one, right, there's this just sort of enigmatic sort of quality about it, sort of mystical quality about it, just even kind of looking at it, that it looks supernatural, right?
Yeah.
Um,
big and bright and red.
Right. And it seemed like something that I could potentially identify on my own. And um, so I became really interested in it and tried to find information about it. At the time, people didn't really have internet in their homes. People that did have it just kind of wasn't very good. It'd take like 10 minutes to log in and, 10 minutes to load a page or whatever. So there wasn't really that access to information like we have today. And and it was really difficult to find any good information about it. So the reference point really is psilocybes, you know, 2 to 4 grams or something like that. And that's not necessarily, it doesn't really transfer over to Amanita muscaria. The dosing is different, the effects are different. And all the field guides I could find, right, said it was poisonous. So,
Right.
was very hesitant to approach this mushroom, but I did lots of research and read what I could find, and which wasn't much, but I did come across, some incredible articles. And so part of the impetus for writing the book was really sort of creating the book or the resource that I wished that I had had. Something that has information about identification, that has information about preparation, that dives deep into some of these potential mythological connections. So that was really kind of the drive behind it, is sort of creating a book that I wish I'd had, and assuming or hoping that other people would, appreciate that same sort of access to information in a single volume. So
Yeah.
that was really kind of the the driving force or idea behind putting the book together. And then part of that too is the book is a mix of a lot of new content, but also includes some chapters that have papers and articles that have just been out of print and are obscure otherwise. And I just felt, this is some great material. People should have access to it and be able to read it. And so I reached out to those authors to see if those could be included in this volume. And thankfully a lot of those people said yes. And so that's where some of that material comes from as well.
Yeah, you got some great content in there, like from Robert Rogers, Gordon Wasson, Trent Austin. There's, I mean, and then all the mythology too. Like I've probably read the Gluckspills, the Lucky Mushroom. I've probably read
Yeah.
that like at least 3 or 4 times. It's the original story of Hansel and Gretel, and Rapunzel is the dwarf or whatever you want to call it.
Right, right. So it's a variation, I think, on Hansel and Gretel. Um, so I think, the earliest sort of writing of it, we look at the Brothers Grimm, I think, which is based on earlier kind of folk tales and things like that.
Right.
Um, so this incorporates, Hansel and Gretel as sort of the heroes of the story. Um, and I don't know much about sort of the source or the inspiration for the story, but there's all these elements in the story that are really fascinating, including the incorporation of all these symbols of luck, and the story of kind of the journey of going into the woods, this magical realm, and then returning with with luck, right? They come
Right.
back with the clovers and the marzipan pigs and all those things.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was it was a find that when I found it, I just thought, man, this has got to be, I got to find a way to fit this in here.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because it's like that even a story as old and as, you know, foreign as that, we still see like the motif of the hero's journey, like outlined by
Exactly.
like Gordon I forget his name.
Campbell.
Joseph Campbell, yeah. And it's funny because it's like they go on this adventure and it's mystical and magical, and then when they return, it's almost like Harry Potter dealing with like muggles where like they can't see the magic, and then they look down, they were holding real pig, but then it turns into a chocolate pig, and
Right.
that's why like culturally chocolate pigs and four-leaf clovers are significant for luck. Is like,
Right.
so um, so yeah, it's just like I sell the Fly Agaric Compendium in my store, and um, you know I'm really a huge proponent of knowledge, and I think it's one of the most fascinating um mushrooms, supplements, whatever you want to call it, because a lot of people typically either things are easy to sell and there's not a whole lot of like information they need to digest. But
Mhm.
something about Amanita is very unique as far, from like a marketing standpoint. It's like it requires a lot of information and it also is a good seller. So it's an interesting phenomena, you don't really see.
Right. I mean, it has that kind of novelty aspect to it, and it's been, sold as sort of this novelty ethnobotanical since, at least since the late 80s, early 90s. But the interest in it has really changed in the last, 5 to 10 years. It's seems like a clear and radical kind of growth and interest in the mushroom, which has been really interesting to
Right.
watch. I'd written several articles about it in the, you know, early 2010s, and there just wasn't a lot of, I'd occasionally get messages from people about something I'd wrote, but there wasn't a whole lot of interest in it. And something about the mid to late teens, something kind of seemed to switch. Um, and now there's all this content and discussion and going on. It's very interesting
Right.
to watch
And the gummies.
and right and the gummies and so there's this marketing that right. I mean, this is right. It's the Mario mushroom. It basically sells itself because everybody has an idea of what it is. I won't say they know what it is, but everybody has some sort of idea of what it is. Um, and so I think it's easy to sell, and so we see that as it's become sort of this Trojan horse for people realizing that either they don't have the chemical know-how or it's too expensive to work with the compounds, but it's a good gateway to sell something else as it. So we've got the, gummies coming out of Florida and other places that are Amanita gummies, but um, have been shown to have psilocybin in them, and there are reports that they may have cannabinoids in them. And um,
Right.
in any event, when you have a dishonest marketing campaign, it's hard to know what's in a product at any given time. One batch may have one compound in it, another may have a different compound in it, which raises some safety concerns. And one of the things that also I find worrying is if people are are consuming these products, and it's something like psilocybin, it's providing a tryptamine type experience. Eventually, one of these people is going to say, "Well, I want the real deal. I'm going to go get some of these mushrooms and gobble them up, or something like that."
Right.
And I worry that this is sort of a perfect storm for people ending up in the hospital, or having a really bad experience, because the tryptamines and the isoxazoles in Amanita muscaria are incredibly different compounds in terms of their actions and the effects that they produce.
Right. Yeah. We did have one user report who was allergic to cannabis, that she had eaten a gummy, and I forget what the medical diagnosis is, but something cannabisosis or something, where she had an allergic reaction to the synthetic cannabinoids that were in the gummies.
Right.
Um, it's wild to it's kind of really like shown me like the real underbelly of the whole like CBD market, and just how we're in that phase that we were
Mhm.
in a couple years ago with CBD. Now like we're in there with Amanita, and it's weird. It's
Right.
really weird, and I just really hope that it doesn't end up like what happened with salvia, and like we talked about that before. And if you could just maybe touch on that, if for the listeners who don't know about salvia and what happened.
Right. Um, well, let's see. Well, so salvia, I mean, it was kind of its heyday was sort of like late 90s, early aughts.
Right.
Um,
That's when I was doing it.
and and a lot of the head shops around the United States were selling it as legal weed, right? So you get a bunch of teenagers, you know, using this stuff in the back alley, and they think they're gonna get stoned, and they end up, having weird, dimensional sort of changes and alterations that are, very different than getting, um, a mild buzz. I mean, the cannabis at that time it was getting stronger, but it was, we still had the terms like one hit wonder, that, right? If you got the cannabis that was get you stoned in one hit, that was like the good. And now it's all like that, right?
It's all one hit one. It's one hit anxiety.
Right, right. So, at the time period, that was sort of the expectation, is that, you'd get, kind of a buzz, and salvia is really can be very transformative in a very unpleasant way. Which is quite different from the traditional use of it in the Mazatec Highlands, where it's used sublingually and produces much milder and manageable effects.
I've actually tried it that way, where like I've heard you could chew on the leaves or make a tea, and
Mhm.
I chewed on them, and it was a completely different experience. It was very interesting, and I actually enjoyed it. Um,
Right,
yeah, whereas
right. I
like
mean,
smoking, a salvia concentrate to me just was absurd. Like every time I did it, it was totally absurd. And I was like the last time I did it, it was just like it was like I was riding a roller coaster. And it was all black and white, and really like there was some really boring music playing, and I was
mhm.
seeing like on this roller coaster, like, oh, there's that trip that I had on salvia. Oh, there's that trip I had. Oh, there's that one. And it was kind of like, are you done yet? Like,
Right.
and then and like the funny thing was my friend was sitting there with me, and he I can see his face at the end of my roller coaster tunnel, and he's just
uh,
smiling at me going, "Are you done yet? Are you done yet?" And I was like, that was the stupidest trip I've ever had, and that was just I know that there are
yeah,
ceremonial and sacred uses for this plant, and I want
Right.
to, respect and honor the indigenous cultures that have used it. But like, I was not, I was one of those teenagers that just, was exploratory. And,
Right.
one of the statistics of, why it should be regulated, unfortunately, but, um, yeah, it's just
And
unfortunate what happened to it because we don't have proper culture around psychedelic use.
right, right. And so, I mean, it was interesting because that was something that was definitely on the DEA's radar. And it really kind of dropped off the radar because it turns out that, people would try it once or twice and we're done, right? That was kind of they moved on. And so the DEA kind of let it go. And I think largely, Datura's in that same category. Occasionally some teens hear about it and think, oh, this sounds like a good idea. It's not a good idea. And they don't do it again. And so these are things that aren't regulated. And I would say traditionally, probably Amanita muscaria fell into the same category because people just didn't know how to use the mushroom. They didn't know what to expect. And, you know, the three, I think, most common results, in past decades is that people ate the mushroom and didn't have an effect, or they ate it and got sick and it didn't have any other effect, or they ate too much and or get stuck in some sort of time warp.
Right.
um and in all three of those situations, um people don't tend to come back to that
Right.
substance.
Yeah, even
um
even Terrence McKenna wrote about Amanita muscaria and his experience with it. And somebody who people would consider like a psychedelic godfather of the modern age had I think maybe one experience with Amanita and was like basically it's nothing to write home about. Like,
right, I think he was nauseous and sweaty and that.
yeah, right. Right.
and so that goes to a lot of just the lack of information and understanding around the mushroom at that time. And Gordon Wasson came out with his theory about soma in the late 60s. And soma is the ancient sacrament uh, of India, where there's a whole book of poems, the Rig Veda, that's dedicated to soma. And the Rig Veda is one of the holy books that's kind of the precursor to later Hinduism. Um, and so Wasson proposed that the Amanita muscaria is the soma, and his focus was on preparation. He said, "Look, it's about preparation," and his theory was really popular for a long time, but people never figured out how you're supposed to prepare it.
Right.
So I think people kind of lost interest in his ideas because they thought, well, the poems talk about this, sort of amazing um, kind of hallucinatory experience and feelings of power and godliness, and
Right.
this mushroom that makes you sick just doesn't fit the bill.
Right. Which I
But
just want to say adds to the occult nature of this mushroom, where it's like it's hidden in plain sight, like it grows on almost every single continent. It's the Super Mario mushroom, the Alice in Wonderland mushroom. But if you don't prepare it properly, either like nothing's really going to happen, or like you're going to have a negative experience if you don't prepare it with, decarboxylation, or
right.
um it's or you don't take enough, or maybe the mushroom was less potent than the other one, and so I feel like it's like behind closed doors, like the real
Uh-huh.
medicine and the magic that comes with this mushroom.
Right. I mean, I think it's one of these things that's, it's not your sort of McDonald's Happy Meal trip, right? Where it's just kind of served to you and you eat it and you have this fantastic experience. It does take it takes some dedication, it takes some learning and understanding. And the mushroom doesn't really, there's this kind of culture of, McKenna talked about the heroic doses, and for him that was what, 5 grams of psilocybe with maybe some paganum harmala to give it a little kick. Um, and now it's not uncommon to hear people talking about taking 10 to 20 grams of psilocybes.
I
And
know.
and so there's this sort of culture uh this mega dosing, and it doesn't work with this mushroom. But anybody that goes in with that attitude is gonna it's gonna come out the other end, worse for wear.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I've personally had about 2 hero doses with Amanita, and they have been the most challenging experiences I've had in my entire life. And I was grateful to be alive afterwards.
Right.
And a lot of people feel the same way. If you go on YouTube or Arrowhead and you find hero doses of Amanita, like people are like, oh, you go through hell a lot of times.
Mm,
And there's so much gratitude for life afterwards, and there is
right.
a medicine with that shadow and that darkness, but like that's not something that you recommend. Like, hey, you want to have a good time, go do that. It's like I think a lot of people really are looking for something like psilocybin or LSD or these other serotonergic tryptamines. And Amanita is like a different language. It's like a different genre.
Right.
It's a muscimol is a GABA agonist. It's more similar to alcohol or benzodiazepine. But you can certainly trip on it. It's just
Right.
not the kind of trip that most people are used to.
Right. Or prepared for.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so it does. I mean, it's a kind of an interesting space, and I think that'll be one of the things that'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because I think we're at a point in time where there's a lot of interest around psychedelics, particularly potential medical applications of psychedelics. But we
Right.
also have this sort of prevalent attitude around, um, or sort of philosophy about megadosing, and to some extent, there's people that say, well, if you're not going to megadose, then don't even bother, right? Or you're
Right.
not going to get anything out of it unless you take these huge doses. And um, so those are conversations that are going to happen within the psychedelic community about, I'm not saying people, if that's their thing, that they shouldn't do that.
Right.
But I think that there's, a time and place. I think it works for certain people and not for others. Um, and it's certainly not something that could be applied to every single plant that's considered psychedelic or psychoactive.
Right.
Because each of the plants have their different attributes, and can be quite different.
Yeah. Do you feel like the whole mega dosing idea? I mean, do you feel like it's like a Western cultural thing? Like more is better? I mean, because yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Going back to the 90s, there was all the like no fear t-shirts, and these sort of attitudes of, go big or go home. And
Right.
I think those are still kind of prevalent attitudes. And if we're looking at psychedelics and plant medicines as potential therapy, you don't want to be leading somebody into an experience that's going to cause post-traumatic stress, for example,
Right.
because then you're adding on to the psychological problems
Right.
um,
Right.
that they're dealing with. And I understand the attitude of people say, look, you got issues, just let's break everything and put it back together.
Right. Right.
Um, but that doesn't work for everybody, and it's not necessarily the best way to go about dealing uh with trauma that people might be dealing with.
Yeah, I work with a lot of therapists and energy healers that work around with microdosing,
Right, right,
different substances like psilocybin or wachuma or even hape and Amanita Muscaria. And I think that the microdose in general is far more accessible to more people. So I think,
yeah,
it's like I think for a hero dose, I mean, you have to prepare ahead of time, you have to integrate afterwards, you have to be like completely, in a place, hopefully with a shaman, a guide, or a trip sitter for
right,
a minimum of 8 hours, depending on what you're taking. Um,
right,
and then you can't drive, you have to like change your whole thing or your whole
yeah,
schedule. And I think with microdosing, it's almost like the integration is like a built-in process if you're living a mindful life. Um,
right.
yeah. So, it may not be Western, but it might just be like kind of this machismo attitude of, like if you're not hero dosing, like you're not even doing it, bro.
Right, right, right. And I think microdosing is sort of the counterpoint. Maybe the response to this sort of mega dosing kind of philosophy. And I think this is where Amanita has a lot of value. And I'll expand on that from microdosing um to let's say slight mild dosing or shallow dosing or some other terminology that I think having small amounts and having a physiological response um is part of the therapeutic action.
Yeah,
And 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 from my perspective, I think in many ways Amanita muscaria is more valuable in that realm than other psychedelic substances, right? So for the
I
philosophies
agree.
or with, yeah. And so all the medical research that's happening with psilocybin, they're looking at doing, right, like you were saying, these, not necessarily a mega dose, but a full trip dose, and you're in a clinical setting for 6 to 12 hours, depending on what the substance is, and there's a therapy beforehand and afterhand. And I think that has value in it. And I am, I think the research is exciting. I am a little hesitant in what the outcomes are, because I see this movement to medicalize. um Personally, I would rather see a decriminalized than a medicalized.
Same
Because what
here.
we're
Yeah.
looking at is therapist. You see a therapist for an hour, you're already spending, I don't know, $100 or something. So you're seeing a therapist for 12 hours. This is
Did you
this is
see
going
the
to be.
Did you see the
Go ahead.
pricing chart that came out recently with one of these psilocybin microdosing therapies?
No.
It was insane. It was like to be medically supervised. Now I understand they have a whole staff, and
Right,
they're
right.
providing the medicine and everything. But it was like to microdose, it was like $300 to $500 per person. And then to have a moderate dose, it was like 1,200 to 2,400. And then to have like a full on, it was like you had to spend almost $4,000
Yeah.
for for a session. And that was like included a pre-visit and a post-visit and all that. But it's just like Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that's great if you're in movies and TV shows and you can, afford this stuff. But it's
right.
not, for me, the idea behind psychedelic medicine was never, hey, let's do this research and let's make it available to uber rich people.
Right, right. I mean, like it's almost like I understand, there's this whole movement of like decolonize psychedelics, and that there's a part of it that feels like almost like um I don't know, like virtue signaling, but then there's another part where I get it, where it's like these medicines are only available to people that are super wealthy. I mean, even like
Right,
some people, that I know that I can go to an ayahuasca ceremony and it's like, $800 for like a weekend thing. And like
right,
for most people, like that's almost a month's salary if they're like in a poverty level, so
right,
it's it's a weird world. I feel like a lot of people that are in that poverty level have a lot of the trauma because they're really getting the bottom of the barrel, and we just we live in a strange world.
right,
Yeah,
right. But even, I mean, even beyond that, I mean, even, you know, the middle class is, you're looking at, do you take your family on vacation or do you do this therapy?
right.
You got to choose one.
Plus you have to
Um,
take the time off to do that, maybe hire a babysitter or dog sitter. It's a whole thing.
right. And then that adds, hundreds of more dollars. So I think in that regard, I think Amanita muscaria is a lot more versatile,
Yeah,
because its therapeutic action occurs in low doses. You don't need a trip dose to have therapeutic benefit from this mushroom. So you might not be using it to treat, past traumas or things like that, but you can treat everyday things that people are struggling with that impact overall health. If people aren't sleeping at night, that has a cumulative effect over time. If people are dealing with anxiety that prevents them from doing their job or being social, um, and even people are talking about using Amanita muscaria to wean off of things like benzodiazepines, alcohol, and other substances. And
right.
these people aren't taking full-on trip doses. They're taking maybe a couple 1 or 2 grams, maybe less.
Yeah,
And it's enough to have that physiological response to the mushroom, but not enough to impair the person. They don't have to, you don't have to stay home
right,
because, because the anti-anxiety medication that requires you to stay home isn't really
right,
doing the job,
right,
right?
right, right. Yeah, you should be able to go live your life as
Right,
you normally would and not be impaired to drive a vehicle or having impaired judgment,
right,
which is something like I think for myself personally, I'm a little more prone to anxiety. So things that are like stimulating, like caffeine or sugar or even psilocybin, can actually create some anxiety in me. And I had a long history with cannabis. I quit using cannabis. I found Amanita, and it helped me get the benefits I was looking for from cannabis, like relief from anxiety, relief from depression, help with sleep. But I didn't have the dependency, and I didn't have like the adverse effects. Um, and it's interesting because it's by a different metabolic pathway. And
right.
one thing I've noticed with some of my clients is like some people are using it to get themselves off of opiates or
Mhm,
SSRIs, which is
mhm.
so interesting because it's a GABA agonist.
Right. Right. Yeah, I've been curious about that. I really, the use with the benzodiazepines and alcohol makes a lot of sense to me
Right.
from a pharmacological standpoint, since those drugs and muscimol, the primary compound, and Amanita muscaria, both work on the GABA system in the brain. And so it makes sense that you'd have a muscimol, something that can provide a similar effect without the dependence,
Right.
that can help people move away from something that may have been, a crutch for anxiety or depression or something else. And that can sort of fill that gap, allow that functionality without creating the dependence that interferes, that ultimately then appears with functionality, right? People go to benzos and alcohol because they need something to help them function, but
Right.
eventually it takes away that functionality.
Right.
Um, so I think there's some interesting uh, possibilities here.
Yeah, it's interesting that Amanita doesn't have dependency issues. It actually has the opposite. A lot of people will build a tolerance and they may go for a period of time and not take it for weeks or even up to a month or months on
Mhm.
the on a microdose regimen. Um,
Right, right.
it's very interesting how pharmacologically something so similar to benzodiazepines has such a different effect and experience. And it's the same thing with serotonergic substances like psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, LSD, how they're all going through the same pathway, but they're very different. um,
Yeah, I mean the tolerance issue is something that I still puzzle over. Um, so most people would put Amanita muscaria in the psychedelic category. I don't know that that is an appropriate classification. I think it has psychedelic type qualities, but I think it's different enough that calling it psychedelic can be misleading, because people have certain expectations based on that terminology. But typically psychedelics, right? They have a tolerance period, usually a few days to a week, maybe longer, depending on the size of the dose. Um, so that period where if you take a certain amount of mushrooms on Friday, then taking the same amount of mushrooms the next day or a couple days later, you're not going to achieve that same level. You might not have an effect, or you just have a low effect. But the Amanita muscaria is kind of puzzling in this regard, because people's experiences seem to vary quite wildly.
yeah.
Some people will report a decrease effect, others report increased sensitivity.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. That's
and of
interesting.
course,
It's like yeah, it's like you take more. It's almost like I think is that the same thing with kava? Uh,
I'm not sure,
okay. Sorry, go on.
but so in contrast to the psychedelics, you have the SSRIs, where people have to take them for a month for it to build up in the system before it has an effect. So then you're looking at a substance that has a cumulative action, whereas something that has an immediate sort of tolerance that
Yeah.
diminishes its action. So it's not really clear. It's not really clear that the reports are quite different. It'd be interesting to see some studies done on that.
Right. Yeah, one thing that's interesting, I got Baba Masha's book, Microdosing
Okay.
Amanita Muscaria, and she had put together a massive compilation. I think it was maybe thousands of user reports for microdosing. And with my business, I've heard a lot of anecdotes from customers. And one thing that I found very interesting was that, and it's the same thing with psilocybin, where like everybody's idea of a microdose is so different. Like
Right.
I heard one guy was like, yeah, I microdose psilocybin. And I'm like, how much do you take? And he's like, I take 1 gram. I'm like, dude, that's not a microdose. Like you're kind of just tripping.
Right.
Like you might have built a tolerance to it and you're used to like, everything's a little wavy, but that is not a microdose by any standard. But I even, I'll even have people that are microdosing. Like I had one person quit using her benzodiazepine drug on, no joke, 30 milligrams of Amanita muscaria, used 5 days on, 2 days off, or something like that. Now she
Wow.
was on a very mild dose of benzodiazepine, but most people weaning themselves off of benzodiazepine typically need a higher dose because they're like meeting
Right.
that deficit that the benzos created. Um,
Right.
and most people, I would say, are consuming anywhere from 100 milligrams to 2,000 milligrams, maybe even 3,000 milligrams or 3 grams worth. But
Right.
it's also, I think there is something to say too about the bioavailability of something like a tea or tincture versus eating the dried caps.
Right.
So plus we have the wild card of, these amanitas can vary in potency tenfold, one growing beside another, and
Right.
and then throughout the season as well. It's a very odd mushroom. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just, it's one reason I'm very grateful for you for creating the Fly Agaric Compendium and kind of weaving together mythology and science and practical knowledge and identification and user experiences, because there hasn't, like you said, you were looking for this information, and so you just decided to weave it all together, and it's so valuable. It's so awesome that we have this. So I just want to thank you for that. And I guess you know I guess we should probably get into some of the basics of Amanita muscaria. A lot of people who are listening to this podcast are probably following me. They may be following you, but for those who are just hearing this for their first time, let's just pretend like, we're talking to a completely new audience. So, I guess we could start with, we've covered a lot already, but how would you guide somebody in identification, and how to dry and prepare Amanita muscaria?
Right. Right. So it is a relatively easy mushroom to identify. There's always room for mistakes, and I think people people that have become accustomed to picking mushrooms and things that seem obvious to them are not always obvious to the newcomer. I remember when I started, the chanterelles and false chanterelles looked alike, and now to me they look almost nothing. I mean, I see broad similarities, but I puzzle over, well, how does one confuse these? But there is that moment when someone's learning. um, there are some lookalikes of Amanita muscaria, and it will depend on your geographic territory. So it's good to know the lookalikes. I'm not familiar with any that are deadly, poisonous. One of the things that comes up a lot is people say, "Oh, you could confuse it with Amanita phalloides or something like that." And Amanita phalloides is like the most deadly mushroom that we know. And of course, one shouldn't pick it and eat it, but I have a hard time seeing the similarities between the two mushrooms.
Right.
Um, so it is worth knowing sort of the basics, knowing what's in your area. It's always good to go with somebody that's experienced when you're picking something for the first time. And I think with the Amanita muscaria, one of the things that trips up the newcomer, and this happened to me as well, is cap color.
Yeah.
So the newcomers always focus on cap color. Well, it has to be this bright red mushroom.
Right.
Um, and really the cap can be white, it can be yellow, it can be peach colored, it can be orange yellow, orange red, it can be red. Um, it could be all these different colors. And currently these are categorized into different varieties, such as Gassawii being the yellow variety, um, or the Persicina being the peach, and Persicina actually being its own species. Um, but there's some talk about at least the varieties being consolidated into a single uniform species and just sort of not making distinctions based on cap color.
Right.
Um, so I would say, the cap color is important. It's still an identifying feature, but it's not the like de facto identifying feature.
Right.
But usually what people want to look at is you consider the cap, right? It should be somewhere in this yellow to red category. Um, it can be white, but if you're new, I would avoid picking white capped ones.
Right.
Um,
Just leave
because
those
then you are,
ones for the slugs.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
look for the yellow to red, the warts on top. And then what you're looking at is at the base of the mushroom, there should be a enlarged bulb at the ground level. It might be underground, so you might have to kind of dig it up. And with the muscarias, um, and with amanitas, really, you want to have the whole mushroom. So
Right.
if you got to make sure you have the whole mushroom out of the ground. So don't be cutting it off at the
Right.
stalk, because you're going to lose important information.
One thing I like to do is take a knife about an inch away from the base and dig it straight down and then try to pry the whole base up. Because
Yeah.
it's really important what you're saying that there are 4 to 5 different base types. There's I'm there's the sac, there's
Mhm.
the basal bulb,
Mhm.
there's kind of like the boot. There's a couple different ones that are, like you're saying, key identifiers for the species, where if you are looking at the cap color alone, you could assume it's something else. Um,
Right.
and also the presence of warts or not, right? If it's been raining, if it's, been dry, that can all change the cap color. And if
Right. And
you're
there may not be, if it rains, the warts could be washed off. So it can look different.
right,
Um, and there used to be a debate about, sort of the picking, plucking versus cutting,
right, right,
and whether it damages the mycelia, and there isn't any evidence that it damages the mycelia. So, get in there, get the whole mushroom out. And then what you're looking at is above the bulb. The bulb is maybe sort of a kind of a golf ball kind of shape at the bottom. There's usually a series of kind of shaggy concentric rings that ascend up the stalk. And that's kind of the the pivotal sort of identifying feature when you're looking at the muscarioid species, and muscaria in particular.
right,
So the cap color with the warts and that series of ascending concentric rings at the base of the mushrooms are sort of the important features.
right, right. So yeah, so for people listening, they should be aware of the seasonality of when the mushrooms are going to be around, and then their specific location. They should know what types they're looking for. So I'm in Pennsylvania. The ones I'm looking for are the Amanita Muscaria variation Gissaui, potentially being called chrysoblema, but right now.
Right.
um, and then there's actually some pantheroids here too, which I did find last year. They are a little sketchy on the identification,
Mhm.
but the Amanita velatipes and the Amanita multisquamosa.
Right.
So if you were in the South, you South United States, you'd be looking for the Amanita persicina.
Right.
And then there's kind of like there's a map. Somebody made a map, I forget, but and then on the west coast of the United States, there's the Flava vulvata,
Mhm.
right? And even technically the Amanita muscaria a little bit.
Potentially, there's some kind of debate around that.
Yeah.
But typically it's generally considered to be the subspecies Flavivulvata. And there are some reports of the the Formosa variety, which is
Oh,
also a
right.
yellow cap variety,
Right.
to be in isolated parts on the West Coast.
So those three, like Flava vulvata, um, what was the one you just said?
Formosa,
Formosa,
variation
right? The
Formosa.
subspecies for Formosa, and then true Muscaria. Those three would have different genetics, so you'd have to run a genetics test on those to confirm them. Is that right? Or even looking at the spores under a microscope?
Well, so potentially, so you mentioned the Chrysoblema earlier. And so
Right.
these are all varieties that people are talking about consolidating into a single species category. Um, so, genetically they're having those conversations. And the main distinctions that are being made are really looking at kind of the cap color, which is not really a determining factor. So I imagine in the next couple of years, we'll hear a little bit more, maybe from Rod Tullos or somebody else who's kind of working on with the Amanita genetics.
Right. Yeah, I remember Spike Mikulski was all on that whenever it was coming out. And I asked Alan Rockefeller, I was like, what's going on with this, man? And he's like, I think it was the Chrysoblema, the original species that was found was not genetically tested.
Mm.
And there was some theory that like the Gissaui, or I don't know what it was exactly, but that one of the caps was sun bleached, making it
Oh,
white.
okay. Right.
Um, and so there was a gray area around that. But anyway,
But
for the
I mean,
common man.
right. But as an example, in my area, I find I find them white. I find them peach colored. I find them red. Find them orangish red. And this is all in, the Pacific Northwest. And so based on the, cap color, you could argue that there are different varieties, but they're all growing the same place. There's not any reason to suspect that they're different.
Right. So you could say it's potentially just a phenotype or a characteristic of the same species. And I
Yeah.
find the same thing here in Pennsylvania. There could be a patch of amanitas where one part of the patch gets a little more sunlight and
Mhm.
then the other part doesn't get as much. And the patch that gets sunlight is a little more bleached out or even white. Um,
Right.
or even like, completely white and like kind of brittle if it's been dry. And then
Right.
the shadier spot is like a deep orange, yellow. I've found that even with a touch of frost, they get a little peach color. Um,
Yeah.
so, and like sometimes those concentric rings around the base, they even look different. But it's
Mhm.
really important, I think, to distinguish between those concentric rings and something like the sac like vulva. right?
Right.
So
Right.
that'll be like with the Caesar's mushroom, the Amanita jacksonii, those have a
Mhm.
very distinct sac, right? Or is that, would that be right? Or is that a boot?
It's no, it's not one of the booted ones. The the gematoids and pantheroids tend to be booted, having that collar. Um, and the Caesaria or the Jacksonii, I forget um, specifically what it is, but it will have a different formation at the base of the mushroom.
Right.
And same with phalloides and the deadly ones are in a different section of the Amanita genre.
Right. So would you feel comfortable explaining how to identify the phalloides, or like some characteristic differences between the muscaroids and the ones that are deadly to kind of help the listeners in identification?
Well, let's see.
I'll pull out your book
Uh,
too.
right, right. Let's see.
If not, it's totally fine, and it's
Well,
because it's
I'll hold up the picture here. I don't know if it'll. No, it's gonna blur it out.
okay. Yep.
There's a picture in the book that compares some of the different bases, but
Right.
with phalloides, for example, it's not going to have warts on it. The base is going to be different. The
Right.
coloration is going to be different. The one place you want to be careful is with the white capped muscarias,
Right.
because then when you get into the white coloration, then you're getting into a situation where the cap color becomes potentially similar to something like
Right.
phalloides.
Right.
So
Like a
so
phalloides could
typically,
never be orange or red. If anything, it would be like kind of an off-white to gray color.
or maybe I think it can even be kind of like a yellowish or greenish.
Okay.
Um, so so they're avoid things that are questionable. If
Right.
you ever doubt something, you know,
Yeah.
leave it alone, and best to find somebody that has some experience. And with the internet, anybody viewing this, I assume, has access to the internet. You can post photos on there are mushroom ID groups on Facebook, and there are knowledgeable people on there. There are also people that aren't knowledgeable. So
Right.
uh, but usually the people in the groups will know, and they can clue you in to who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't. And usually the information is fairly good. So if you have doubts, always you can get a second opinion. But never eat anything that you're not confident about the identification of it.
Right. Well, that
Um,
yeah, so that kind of leads into the next question. So let's say somebody found an Amanita muscaria in the wild. They have confidently identified it. I like to go by three very reliable sources, like triangulate the confirmation, like yes, three times. That's what I like to
mhm,
do. Um, and so the muscarias have ibotenic acid and muscimol in them, and
mhm.
there's a way to dry them. Do you want to get into that? Like what the you know I know there's a lot of different theories on this, but
Right.
if you could share about the dehydration process.
Right. So ibotenic acid and muscimol are the two psychoactive compounds. Um, but muscarine is not one of the psychoactive compounds, contrary to the labeling on some of the popular Amanita gummies. It's not typically
Ridiculous.
something you're looking for. Um, it is present in some degree, usually very low concentrations. But so primarily we're looking at ibotenic acid and muscimol. Muscimol is about maybe 5 to 10 times more potent than ibotenic acid, and it tends to have more of a sort of kind of relaxing and calming quality. The ibotenic acid is thought to be a little bit more energetic and stimulating. It also can contribute to GI issues such as nausea, vomiting, things like that. And there's some speculation that in the fresh mushrooms that it's all ibotenic acid. And so it's important to understand the relationship between the two compounds, is that ibotenic acid is basically a precursor to muscimol.
Right.
So that it goes through a process called decarboxylation, where the compound loses a carboxyl group, and then that produces muscimol. And there's different ways that one can aid this process. One of them is drying the mushrooms. And the drying process converts a certain portion of ibotenic acid to muscimol. So this is typically something that is recommended, particularly for people who are starting out with this mushroom, that it's best to work with it in its dry form.
Right.
You will find people online that swear by using it fresh, and I think that's great. For people that like that, it's not something that I would ever recommend to somebody that is not already experienced with this mushroom. If you work with this mushroom for a year or 2 years and feel like you want to try using it fresh, then as long as you've kind of done your due diligence and are prepared for potential GI discomfort,
Right.
that yeah. But typically the prudent way to go is to dehydrate. There's debate about what the best temperatures are to use. And I just recommend using a low temperature, using a food dehydrator. Um, but you can get into debates with people about what's the optimal temperature to do it at.
Yeah, it seems
I
like based off of that one chart that we reference a lot in the Amanita Muscaria Science and Magic group on Facebook,
Yeah.
that, like, in my opinion, there's kind of a sweet spot where,
Mhm.
because it's like there's more, like, the hotter you go, the more decarboxylation you get, but
Mhm.
also the more degradation of muscimol. So,
Right.
and this is something that people will come to me and say, like, are your caps, like, I'm selling caps, and they're asking, are these fully decarbed? And I'm like, I don't
Right.
know if that's just like a new person question, or if there's somebody talking about some misinformation where, like, caps can be fully decarbed. It's like, yeah,
Right.
I can fully decarb caps, but there's going to be no muscimol in them. Like, they're not going to be active at all. Um,
Right.
but then there's like the low, really low and slow, like, below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, where you are still keeping a lot of that ibotenic acid. And
Right.
what I like to do is somewhere between 100 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit,
Mhm.
basically until cracker dry. So that could
Right.
vary depending on the thickness of the caps.
Yeah.
But that's just my personal preference. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is a lot of people want to dry them in the oven, and part of that is not having a dehydrator. The
Right.
ovens are usually too hot, and the result usually isn't very good. It,
Yeah, they might get some burnt crispy tips and then soggy centers.
right, and a lot of fluid leaks out, and the fluid has active compounds in it. So it's not a very effective way to do it. It's also messy. Um, and I understand, dehydrators are, an investment. Usually you can get a good one for, $40 or $50.
Right.
So if it's something that you're interested in, picking and drying your own, over the course of a few years, then it's worth investing in, certainly.
Definitely. I got one of the best brands you can get for home use is an Excalibur,
Mhm.
and they make newer ones, and I found one of the older ones, like a 9 tray big one at a yard
Mhm.
sale for $2, which is
Oh,
like
wow.
a steal. I just fixed the wire on it. It's probably 30 years old and it works great. So I definitely recommend Excalibur. But you can just go to any store like Walmart, Target. You're gonna have a pretty decent home dehydrator for 30, $40.
Right.
And
Right.
they make your amanitas and any other mushrooms or fruit or anything a lot better than and more evenly dehydrated than an oven.
Exactly.
So yeah, and then so we can just say, people have dehydrated them. They've identified them. They've dehydrated them. Also, are they going to be, what should they save the caps and the stems, or what's your thought on that?
Yeah, so people have different opinions. They both the caps and stems have the active compounds in them. The caps tend to be significantly more potent than the stems. But the stems have compounds in them too. So it just kind of depends on, some people just work with caps because if they're, for example, eating them dry, then it's less material to consume, right?
Right.
And some people report that they like the taste of the mushrooms. Other people, it makes them gag.
Right.
Um, so there's a lot of sort of personal preference there.
Oh,
Um,
I wanted to ask, have you ever tried a raw amanita before?
no, I haven't. That's not something that
Yeah.
that I felt compelled to do.
Yeah. I tried it I think it was last year.
Mm,
I ate a half of a small cap. It was I think it was 13 grams wet. So
mm,
and I did it very scientifically. I took the same cap, split it in half, weighed both sides. It was equal, and then
mm,
I dehydrated the second half and had a full decarb tea. And I ate the first half raw. And
uh-huh.
the whole purpose was to just like outline the variance of experiences you can have with the exact
Right.
same mushroom. And I would definitely not recommend eating a raw cap. It was a difficult experience. um, I was sick for the first 2 hours, and it felt very intense. I felt like within 5 minutes of eating it, I was starting to feel it, and that was on an empty stomach.
Right.
And I felt like this kind of tingly, warm energy all around my peripheral of my body. It was a
Mhm.
little uncomfortable, and then the after the first 2 hours, I was okay, but it was kind of like felt like I had taken alcohol and maybe a mild MDMA, and
Right.
it was enjoyable, but it wasn't functional. Um,
Right.
I kind of just felt, a little drunk. So, but there are groups, small groups that just swear by eating the raw caps, but I think it's important to maybe mention that, there have been studies done on ibotenic acid injected intracranially, I believe, right, into rats, and it
Mhm.
was proven to have brain lesioning effects. Is that, yeah,
Right. So ibotenic acid is officially classified as a neurotoxin because it is used in this fashion, and it helps brain researchers study the function of the brain, right? If you can have an and the reason they use this is because they can lesion very specific parts of the brain that when they inject it into the brain, it doesn't kind of diffuse throughout the brain. It focuses on the site of injection, damages that part of the brain, and then they can study how that affects the functioning of the organism.
Right.
So there's a lot of discussion and debate about this online, and people claiming that if you eat Amanita muscaria, that it's going to lesion your brain.
Right.
And hopefully, hopefully it's easy to see that injecting a compound directly into the brain is not really reflective of what happens when you ingest something. It goes through the digestive process. It has to cross the blood-brain barrier, and then what happens when it crosses the blood-brain barrier. So they're not parallel uses, and the impacts of that can't really be compared. There's concern there, obviously, that it has this action, but we don't know how it acts in the brain when it goes through sort of the traditional process of going through the body and the different metabolic processes and passing through the blood-brain barrier. Another thing that's important to understand is while muscimol acts on GABA, ibotenic acid acts on glutamate.
Right.
And glutamate is a naturally occurring, um, losing my words here. It's a neurotransmitter in the brain, like serotonin and GABA, but glutamate is a neurotoxin.
Right.
So it makes sense that ibotenic acid that mimics glutamate in the brain is also a neurotoxin. They are structurally very similar. So I think it's important to remember that uh, to think about these comparisons, that what we're really looking at is we're looking at having excessive concentrations of a neurotoxin in specific regions of the brain at one time is when we see this damage happening.
Right.
We all have glutamate. It's not causing us all brain damage. But if our glutamate gets out of whack, that's something that can cause problems for
Right.
sure. So when you have too much glutamate in a particular region of the brain, it's an excitatory neurotransmitter, causes the nerve cells to become overexcited, and that's what leads to nerve damage. So if you have a high concentration of glutamate in a particular place, you're going to get damage. And so we see that similarly with the injecting ibotenic acid into specific regions of the brain.
Wow.
So something that's interesting to think about, and I'm speculating here, so I don't want anybody to take this as things that are known. But if mental health is related to having a balance of neurotransmitters operating in our brains, right? So often depression is often connected to a low levels of serotonin, although there are other neurotransmitters that contribute to that as well. But serotonin is an easy one to target. So that's kind of what's targeted by the medical profession with the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, making sure that people have enough serotonin. But if people have too little glutamate, so some of the consequences of having too little glutamate are anxiety and anxiety disorders.
Interesting.
Autism is connected to having too little glutamate.
Really? Wow.
Depression and obsessive compulsive disorder, which is another anxiety disorder, are connected to having too little glutamate.
Wow. I
So,
had no idea.
right. So it's possible that people that benefit therapeutically from this mushroom are people that have low glutamate,
Wow.
right? So it's potential, and again, this isn't, you know, studied. It's not, we don't know this, but we can speculate that having uh, a boost through ibotenic acid in the brain uh, could address some of these failings of low glutamate, right? The anxiety, depression, things like that. And by boosting a glutamate through a mimicking compound, may relieve some of those symptoms. And that might be part of what we're seeing. Of course, muscimol itself also uh, can lower anxiety and has that impact as well, though it works through the GABA system.
Yeah. Well, that's very fascinating
So
because,
there's different things.
yeah, go ahead. You were saying?
So there's different things to look at it. On the opposite side, too much glutamate also is problematic, right? We're talking about balance. So too much glutamate can lead to issues with things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer. Those are conditions that are related to having high levels of glutamate. So obviously, that's not something that you want.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's
So
it's
again, we're looking at this
fascinating.
idea of balance.
Yeah, right. And the idea of balance is so, it's so like the effects of Amanita can be literally like, you know, yin and yang. If you have like more ibotenic acid or non-decarb versus full decarb, it's almost like morning time energizing, uplifting, and like nighttime sleepy, dream, sensual dreaming, deep
Right.
inner work. And it's just so wild that too, like, if you have too much glutamate, that could potentiate the negative side effects of Parkinson's, whereas muscimol has actually been studied to alleviate the negative side effects of Parkinson's, to eliminate the or no, it has the free radical scavenging effects that would
Okay.
reduce the negative side effects of Parkinson's, as well as being a neuroprotectant. So it's just like, what other plant or mushroom exists that could like have two almost polar opposite effects? It's just adds to the
Right.
mystique of it.
And I think this goes to, kind of what's been called the entourage effect, right? Is that when you're working with natural medicines, substances, plants and fungi have their own balance. And so we see this in Western medicine. Our scientists want to isolate, well, what's the active compound? We just want that. We're going to give people that. And it can really screw people because they don't have the natural balance that comes with how that compound occurs in nature. Um, so a good example, right, would be we'll go with medical marijuana, right? So the medical marijuana started in the late 70s. Um, this guy, I forget, I think it was Robert Randall, had glaucoma, had this big court case. And so this movement started, and states, and a lot of people don't realize this, but the medical marijuana movement really started, states started passing legislation in the early 80s. And what happened is the DEA and FDA are looking at this and thinking, how do we nip this in the bud? We don't want people, across the country smoking weed to treat their glaucoma and their, things with um, cancer and things like that. So what they did is, okay, we give in. We're going to give you the THC pill, and this is going to
Wow.
solve everything. And so then people could start getting the THC pill, and the THC pill was was garbage. It just didn't,
Was that
it
called
didn't,
Marinol?
it was called Marinol.
Yeah. Okay.
And people didn't benefit from it. It didn't have the therapeutic value of whole plant cannabis. Um, and so that this movement got railroaded by the federal government, who did this bait and switch of like, well, if you want marijuana, then that's basically THC. So we're going to give you THC, and then we don't have to worry about people, growing plants and trading, cannabis and things like that. But it didn't work, and that's because it didn't have that entourage effect, right? There's no CBD
Right.
in a THC pill. There's all these, there's hundreds of cannabinoids uh, in the plant. And, people have started making plant extracts and things like that, that to some degree preserve that balance. But as one example of this idea of, oh, well, we could just isolate this compound and it'll have the same impact. So I think it's important to think about
Yeah.
the balance that plants provide.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it's like I think it's like the Western culture of reductionist scientists of isolating compounds and finding what their effects are, and although that is in some ways probably important, I think that we kind of miss the forest for the trees, and they're like it's just like what was it just THC in that Marinol pill? Is that what was
Yeah.
going on there? Yeah. And so that I am concerned about the same thing happening with Amanita Muscaria. We have there's a couple companies out where you can just buy synthetic muscimol. And I think that there's actually a ton of compounds in Amanita muscaria. They're maybe not like completely psychoactive or in higher concentrations, but I guess I'm kind of worried about seeing the same thing happen with Amanita.
Right. I mean, and so I think that's an important consideration. And I think even working with the plant, people choose to work with the plant in different ways based on what they want out of it, right? So some people say, I want to work with the dry mushroom because it has vitamins, it has nutrients, it has these other compounds in it that I want. And other people, they want to go with the tincture or a tea, um, because it provides a different array of compounds, and so there's different ways to work with it. But if you're looking at products that are just muscimol or just ibotenic acid, then you've got to start thinking about, well, what's missing from that combination.
Right. Yeah, I actually heard. I'm wondering if you could confirm this. Something about it was a good case for also using the stems. That there was something like NAC or some other kind of compound that could help the body metabolize muscimol or ibotenic acid. Do you know about that?
Right. I've seen that, and I haven't really investigated further in that to find out more what that's about. But I've heard that stated that there's something in the stems
Yeah.
that's potentially has an important role to play,
Right.
which would, you know, make sense to then not discard them. But
Right.
I would have to look further into that to find out more about it.
Yeah, the holistic person in me wants it to be true, but the skeptic in me has to confirm it. So
Right, exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
So going back to like identification and dehydration and preparation, um, we talked about dehydrating and the different levels of heat that you could do to produce different um, uh, ratios of ibotenic acid to muscimol. Um, What are some of the ways that people can consume Amanita?
Right. So, clearly, working with dried mushrooms is a very easy way to do it. Um, it's also one of the ways that's led to some of these experiences that we've heard from folks like Terence McKenna, where, he had dried caps but had this kind of unpleasant experience. Um, so I've found in my own research that I've done that people that experience some people experience GI issues with just the caps or the dried mushroom. And often that's reduced by making it into a tea and getting rid of the mushroom solids and just having the tea. So if people are really sort of GI sensitive, then they may want to look at using a tea over using the dried mushrooms themselves. But the other important consideration, going back to, McKenna's experience, right? I think he used, maybe two dried mushrooms or something. And so one of the important considerations with Amanita muscaria is really the dosing and how it's done and understanding how to do it properly. So you mentioned earlier about the variability in potency, and I'm working on a study currently where we've tested mushrooms that are grown the same time of year in the same environment, and one can be 4 to 5 times more potent than another. So that means if somebody's just using whole mushrooms, they say, well, I took 1 or 2 caps last time and had a great experience, so that's my dose. Well, the next time they do that, that dose could be 4 to 5 times higher.
Right.
Um, and that's probably not their dose, right?
Right.
Um, so this is sort of the hot dosing effect that you can have if you're just working with whole caps or whole dried mushrooms. So really, to dose properly and more safely, it's important to homogenize the mushrooms that one has, right? So one can make a large batch of tea and they can freeze the tea into individual doses, or they can grind large amounts of dried mushrooms into some sort of homogenized mixture. Um, Probably people don't want to powder it, because if you plan on making a tea with it, you're just going to have a swampy kind of tea, which is not
It's
not
like
usually what you
impossible to
want.
filter it out.
Yeah, so really a coarse grind should be good enough to get a
Yeah.
fairly homogeneous mixture. Um, and then
Small
that
chunks.
way, yeah, that way you can get a fairly um, you can start to actually measure to some degree, right? There's still going to be some variability, but it avoids the hot dosing situation where you think you're taking one amount. I mean, like for example, if somebody thought they were taking that 1 gram of psilocybe as their microdose, right? And then it
Right.
ended up being 10 grams, right?
Right. That's a
you
big
know,
difference.
That's a big difference. And that's something that you want to avoid, particularly with the Amanita muscaria. The other thing that's important with dosing is a degree of titration.
Right.
So if you think that you want to have 5 grams, then you need to start with 1 to 2 grams, wait an hour, adjust, wait an hour, adjust. Um, so it's good to, start with what you think you want in total and split that up over several hours.
Right.
Um, and I would just generally, even if you have a good sense of what the dose is, it's good to just use that as a practice, so that you can monitor how you feel, um, and you can avoid that oh shit moment where I don't know anymore where I'm gonna wake up, right?
Right.
I don't know where
Right.
I'm going to be in 5 hours, and now I'm really nervous about, what's happening. You don't want to
Right.
end up having that moment.
Right.
So the homogenizing and titrating are ways that can help people get to whatever that sweet spot is that people are looking for, whether they're wanting to kind of microdose or take a subtle, I guess what I'd call a subtle dose, or whether they want sort of a mild sort of psychoactive experience.
Right.
It can help you. These are processes that can help people meet their goals and avoid um, outcomes that might be negative or unpleasant.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to go about it. And I'll usually advise people to wait about 2 hours, just because it's a little different than like other psychedelics. I mean, it seems like the full effects don't fully kick in for up to 2 hours. And I've personally experienced this before, and one thing I've done is urine recycling. So, if I
Okay.
take the Amanita, I would, drink my urine after I ingested it, because I'm actually redosing myself. And I remember I had an overactive bladder. I'm drinking my urine maybe once or twice in a 2 hour period, and then I'm like, I had that oh shit moment and was like, I'm gonna stop doing this, because, and I'm glad that I did, because I ended up having like a full on trip. Um,
Mm,
and the weird thing with Amanita is that it can sneak up on you. Like,
yeah.
I mean, a lot of psychedelics could, but one thing I've noticed and heard with other people is that Amanita can like you can actually fall asleep,
Mm,
and like within 2 to 4 hours after taking it, you might feel really drowsy. And that's the
mhm,
muscimol kicking in. And then you can actually wake up inside of a very hallucinatory experience. Have you heard
mm.
this too?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely one of the possible kind of outcomes, and that can potentially be, disorienting. Um, and one of the things that's distinct about this mushroom, as opposed to, say, the psilocybes, uh, is that it's not a very visual mushroom, right? People don't get the visual effects. Sometimes if that's what people are looking for, they're disappointed. But one of the things that happens at high doses is that you may not be visually hallucinating, but you may not recognize anything that's around you.
Right.
So you could everything may look, you could be downtown walking around town and you might think you're walking through the Smurf village, right? You're not actually seeing, mushroom houses and things like that, but in your brain believes that this is where you are.
Right.
Um, so it
Just
can
gotta watch
be
out for Gorgamel.
right, exactly. Um, and so this is one of these things that I think catches people off guard, is that there is, at high doses, there can be this real disconnect
Right.
where you're not responding, your brain isn't responding to outside stimuli, right?
Right.
You can be walking around anywhere, um, and you may think you're someplace completely different.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that, I think it's maybe important to mention some of the side effects that could happen in those larger doses,
Mhm,
such as blacking out or amnesia.
mhm, mhm,
I've experienced that where, I was in the woods and I blacked out and it was dark, and then suddenly it's light out and I'm on a different trail and I have no idea where I'm at. Um,
right.
and I'm lucky that I was able to find my way back through echolocation, because there was we had a camping neighbor who was shooting guns, and I remembered,
Okay.
oh, I'll follow the noise, and I found my way back to the trail and my camp. But if it wasn't for that, I could have died. I could have been lost in the woods for hours or days.
Right.
And I wasn't prepared to have that experience. And so, what are some other, um, you know, what are some other experiences in general, but also like cautions that people should, consider if they decide to take that leap and take a larger dose, what
Right.
can they expect?
Well, I think one of the things that I bring up is that, you know, Timothy Leary and his cohort introduced this idea of, the trip sitter, right?
Right.
And so a lot of people have latched on to that, and that's become part of this therapeutic research. But a lot of people have just said, whatever, I don't need a trip sitter, blah blah blah. I do this all the time. With Amanita Muscaria, you
That was
need,
me.
yeah, if you're gonna go with a high dose, you need a trip sitter. Um, and for a lot of reasons. One is if you don't know where you are, um, you need somebody who does know where you are.
Yeah.
Um, some of the things that can happen is, if you're at home by yourself, that's a fairly safe environment. But if during a blackout or you're not connected to what's happening, you walk out in the rain in shorts and a t-shirt and are wandering around all night, that's a good way to get hypothermia. Um, and
Or hit by a
so there's
car.
or hit by a car. So I mean, it really is, I think there's a lot of people that feel like this idea of the trip sitter is a little bit silly, but under the circumstances, it can really be a necessary safety measure, um, to have. And it's not like they have to, be sitting there watching you, but, somebody that's in the house that, they hear a door open and they go, okay, I gotta find out what's going on. Um, or even if somebody gets in the tub or the shower, somebody say, man, they've been in the shower or they've been in the tub for 2 hours. Like, that's not safe.
Right.
So I think really having somebody who can be present is important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's the I don't really like to live with regrets, but that was the one regret, is that with my experience, that I didn't have somebody watching me. It was just me and my friends in the experience together.
Right, right, right.
So,
Right. And
um
that's not unusual for, using psilocybes or other things like that. But it's a different substance, it's a different action.
right.
Um,
It
yeah.
almost, like, whenever I hear stories about people who have used datura,
Mhm.
it almost sounds similar, um, but maybe not as intense and as long, because datura can last for days. Um, Whereas Amanita, it seems like maybe it kind of maxes out around 12 to 14 hours. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think, a, a moderate a moderate dose, usually 5, 6, maybe up to 8 hours. A larger dose, it can last, it can go for a while. So there are cases of people who have eaten significant quantities who have been hospitalized and maintained in a hospital for several days.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and and the reports are that the symptoms are prolonged. So that's definitely
Interesting.
not something anybody, wants to do. And that's another reason to make sure you're not at risk of getting a hot dose or anything, like that. That it's
Right.
those cases are rare. they don't happen often, but they happen, and they usually happen because people they're not homogenizing, they're not titrating. They got a bag of mushrooms and say, "Oh, well, I'm gonna eat the whole bag," or or
Right.
whatever. And so there really needs to be this understanding that when you approach this mushroom, it's not it's not psilocybe mushrooms, it's not ayahuasca, it's not LSD, it's not wachuma.
Hmm.
It's its own thing, and it has to be understood within its own context, really.
Right. Right. This is not a classic tryptamine. This is a different genre of effects. And
Right.
yeah, so one thing I hear a lot is and I've experienced it myself, is the concept of time dilation. So time
Right.
seeming like really expanded out or like really condensed. Um
Yeah.
and I believe I've heard you talk about your personal experience. If you want to touch on that, I think the listeners would really love to hear that.
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting, and another one of these distinctions, and I mean, I think it's one of those things where, somebody says, "Oh, well, Amanita muscaria has this time thing." People say, "Oh, well, psilocybin has a time, time slows down." This
Right.
is a whole different ball game, really. Um, so one of the things I'll talk about first before kind of getting into my own experience is this idea of looping that people have, where people get caught in either a thought or behavioral loop.
Right.
And this is one of the time effects, is that and Stamets has a great story about this,
Oh my gosh, classic.
that yeah, he's most recently told it on the Joe Rogan show, but at most of his presentations you can find, versions of the story of he's out with a buddy, he's got his camera, and he drops his camera, and he picks it up, and he thinks, "Did I drop it?" And then he drops it again. He's like, "Oh yeah, I dropped it. It was like that." And he picks it up and drops it again, and he's just sort of stuck in this, like, kind of this thinking of knowing the future and repeating the past. He's like, I know what's going to happen next. I'm going to drop the camera.
Then I
I
dropped
can
the
see the
camera, right?
future.
Yeah.
And then I drop the camera, and then it goes on and on until his camera's, busted.
Right.
Um, and there's another story I think that's told by Andrew Whale and one of his books, about a guy who's, climbs up in a tree, and then he falls out of the tree, and he goes, "Wait, did that just happen?" And he climbs up in the tree again and then falls down again.
Oh my
And he
God.
keeps doing this until, somebody, at the next campsite or whatever says, "We got to take this guy to the hospital because he's like bleeding."
Oh my
And,
God.
he's keeps going to the tree and falling down. So there's these loops that people can get caught in. And this is sort of this perception of time kind of repeating itself, or being stuck in this kind of cycle. Um, and when somebody's stuck in it, it's it feels eternal. It's like the what is it, the Ouroboros, like the snakes biting each other's tail. There's no way out of this cycle. And so people often are stuck in it until the peak, starts to wear off a little bit, and they can figure out that they don't have to continue, this. They can make the conscious choice to no longer engage in this behavior. Um, so my own experience with time was not a loop. It was very different. It was more of it's sort of like time traveling, but maybe not in the classical science fiction sense. Um, but I did have one of these oh shit moments of, I've entered a space that I'm going to be in for the foreseeable future. Um, and I had this moment at the peak of experiencing time stopping. And my perception was that I had entered a space where time no longer existed and I could function in that space without being affected by the constraints of time.
Wow.
And I thought this was the most amazing thing ever. This is a, plot in so many, sci-fi stories and movies, and sort of this idea of kind of occult knowledge around understanding and manipulating the mechanics of the universe, and just thinking, and there's also this very sort of egocentric, sort of narcissistic experience of like, I did this. Like
Right.
I figured out how to like stop time and like control time.
Yeah.
And so sort of this weird sort of like ego sort of mushrooming with this kind of epiphany. And it all seemed very cool until time started moving backwards. And then things were less cool.
Oh man.
And it was, I mean, it was odd because I had this sort of realization that I wasn't in the moment, I wasn't really worried about re-experiencing anything in my life. I mean, I think we all have experiences that are difficult and troubling, that we don't want to go back to those experiences. Um, but I felt very calm about that, and kind of unperturbed by that. But I was also thinking, you know, I got like I got like more than 40 years to go, right? This is gonna take some time.
Oh
And
no.
I was like, I don't know that I want to do this.
The pesky time coming in.
And I also had this other, you know, uh, pesky thing that as a lot of people do, I have multiple clocks in my house and they're not all in sync, right? And I, in the back of my mind, I know this, but I go from one room to the next room, and of course I perceive myself as going backwards, like I've already done this. But in the next room, the clock is, like 5 minutes earlier.
Oh
And so
no.
then I'm thinking like this is like confirmation of my experience of going back in time, and I experience everything in reverse. um
And can I
and
can I ask, so did the clocks look strange or did they just look normal?
I don't remember them looking strange, but I
Yeah.
remember seeing that, that time difference of like, well, one clock said like 10:05 and this one says 10.
Right.
and
Because something
so
I've noticed with Amanita, like when you're in a deep experience like that, it's like it's not like with psilocybin where like things are wiggling and waving and like the colors are changing. It's just
Mhm.
like reality is normal, but it's just different.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
Which makes it
yeah.
very difficult to understand if you're still in the trip or not.
Well, right, right. And that's kind of part of the, I mean, that's part of the trip, right? Is the trying to decide, what's real and what's not real. And the Amanita muscaria has this sort of reputation as a trickster mushroom. Uh, so
Yeah.
the only place we have really documented historical traditional use is in Siberia. So there are other parts of the world where we suspect that it's been used, but we don't have enough evidence to say one way or the other. But in Siberia, it has this reputation as being this sort of trickster mushroom, and so I see the time loops and some of this stuff as part of that kind of trickster element
Right.
of, let's see what we can let's see what kind of chaos we can cause.
Yeah. It's almost like it's kind of poking fun at our ego, right? But it also
Right.
like I've experienced the ego inflation as well with like, you're it's like you're telling your experience, and there's so many things that resonated with me where it's like, I figured out the laws of the universe, and then
Right.
I have the God complex, and I've had this
Mhm.
before with other psychedelics, but I was younger and I'm more aware now, and so whenever I had this God conscious experience where I thought that I was God, I laughed at it. I was like, "Oh, really? That again? Like we're gonna do that
Right.
again? Okay." And um and but then I started to this was after I had the time loops, so I went through like
Mhm.
all these time loops, and it was the same thing where it was like, oh yeah, I remember this, this is, and then I'm going to say this, and then you're going to say that, and then it would happen again and again, and
Right.
and then it would build on itself over and over and over again until I just got to like a breaking point, and that's whenever I proceeded to run through the woods for 12 hours like a berserker.
Right.
Yeah, and but it's so interesting how they have such there's a lot of similar uh overtones and themes to
Yeah.
people's hero doses. So yeah.
And there's a couple points I want to build on that. And one is coming back to Gordon Wasson's theory about soma. And a lot of people say Amanita muscaria, it doesn't produce these ecstatic visual experiences of, crystal palaces or, or whatever it is. But a lot of the poems they talk about, they often focus on this warrior god Indra, and he talks about how powerful and how awesome he feels. And I think, that's Amanita muscaria.
Yeah.
That's, thinking that you are, the universe.
Right.
So I
Right.
see those parallels there. But the other thing I want to touch on is, obviously getting engaged in some sort of like narcissistic ego boost is not the prime result. But I do feel that there is an ego affirming quality to the mushroom, which I think contrasts and complements well with the psilocybes. And
Hmm.
people talk about the ego dissolving properties of psilocybe. Um, and they talk about it within the context of really sort of getting rid of those problematic aspects of our ego. Uh, but but I think a lot of the language and ideology and philosophy has really sort of jumped the shark, if you will, because a lot of that stuff is started by Leary and some of the other folks, and um, but this idea of getting rid of ego, but ego is important, right?
Right.
We all have an ego. It's essential to our social lives. It's essential to our mental and emotional health. And what's really important is not dissolving the ego. What's important is having a healthy ego. And and so I think the psilocybes and muscaria can both be tools for working towards that healthy ego, because we do need to dissolve. We do need to recognize the the sort of toxic barriers that we struggle with individually, but we also need that affirmation, right? That we're not inherently bad people, right? That
Right.
we so I think there's a ego affirming quality with Amanita muscaria that obviously is exaggerated at high doses, in
It's
in ways
very
that can lead.
common. It's very
Yeah.
common. I mean, I'll see people like, I mean, it's a lot of there's some fanatic people with anything, but with
Right.
Amanita, there's a small group of fanatic people that they really believe, and they get into a lot of these conspiracies too, like that, like what John Marco Allegro said, where Jesus Christ wasn't even a real person; it was Amanita Muscaria.
Right.
And that we have some people who believe that there's all these different analogies of like mushrooms in the Bible, being Amanita muscaria, that it's like this, it's the holy grail. It's literally like, the fruit that Adam and Eve ate. And
Right.
I think that when you when you're tripping and you really start thinking about that stuff and you're feeling like God, because
Mhm.
that's what Amanita, and I think there's something beautiful, and it's like complementing what you're saying, where it's like we recognize the God nature within, and
Right.
like the super, like feeling that super consciousness in our ego, but recognizing that, like, okay, this is an experience I had. I'm coming back into my body and my ego, and I'm not that. I'm a part of that. I'm a little
Hmm.
drop in the great ocean, but I'm not the ocean. If I were to actually be the ocean, my whole body and mind would explode into, it's like we're like funneled down consciousness. And I really appreciate what you said with that. I've seen people, and myself included, have the God complex with psilocybin as well. So I think a
Yeah.
lot of it kind of has to do with like what's already going on with people. But
Hmm.
I do see that I do see that kind of like the correlation between the two, kind of tag teaming the ego, balancing it out, right?
Right. I think for the point of illustration, I guess when with the philosophies, people tend to feel like they're part of the universe, right?
Mm,
Everything flows together. But with Amanita on a high dose, you are the universe,
right.
right? So,
Right.
so, so that's kind of the difference.
Oh, okay. So this is very interesting that you're saying this, because it's kind of inspiring some thought in me, where in general people with psilocybin, they'll recognize their like they'll recognize that, like you were saying, they are part of the universe and that they have that connection, whereas they
Right.
might have felt isolated. And so it's more about like connecting with nature, connecting with other people. And when people talk about Amanita muscaria, it's almost like we're going inside. So like there's trauma inside. But then whenever you take those, like, big doses, it's like, it inverts itself. And so the work of the self becomes everything.
Right. Right.
So that's very interesting. I'm kind of yeah, just learning something right now as we're talking. Um, yeah. So
So I mean, it's an incredible contrast, but I think it also makes it, I think it makes the two mushrooms incredibly complementary, in terms of if people are interested in working on trauma or just themselves. It doesn't have to be trauma. We all have things to work through and work on. I think those can be complementary tools potentially if that's the path that one is looking to go down.
yeah. Wow. Well, man, we got to land this ship. So let's it's been about 2 hours. So I think, one thing I just want to, just like, as a fair warning for people, and I, appreciate your time and your sharing your knowledge and your experience. Um, the world of Amanita today, what's your take on it? What are you concerned about? And what are you looking forward to? Just with like
Yeah,
the
that's a great question.
yeah.
Um, it's it's really hard to pinpoint exactly because it's, people have known about Amanita muscaria for a long time, and there just hasn't been more than this sort of niche kind of interest in it for decades. So what's happening right now, I think, is very unusual that there's really a swelling of interest and a proliferation of kind of social media groups and dedicated to this as well as you know um, kind of a cottage industry developing around tinctures and balms and um, classes and ceremony and things like that. So I feel like we're at a very different phase with social interest around this mushroom. So I'm very curious to see kind of where it goes. Um, I would like to see some attitudes around the mushroom transform. That it is, it can be worked with in a therapeutic fashion. It can be used as a food. It has these applications to it that I think can be available to everybody. Um, on the flip side, it does still come with dangers and there are some pitfalls with it. And so I think there's a lot of promise with where this is going. Um, but I think there's, you know, also, possible things for um just this sort of collision of interest in this mushroom with also philosophies around, kind of mega dosing that we talked about, um, that could be sort of problematic to creating maybe a broader acceptance or broader adopting broader applications of the mushroom into people's personal lives, whether it be for insomnia or anxiety or microdosing as a general health practice, things like that. So I think there's a lot of unknowns. It's kind of exciting to see how things unfold and where things will go from here.
Yeah. And do you plan on releasing any more literature? Are you thinking like maybe a Fly Agaric where it's been, where it's going, or are you set on your book for now?
I've got several research projects that I'm working on. One that's focusing on sort of contemporary ceremonial use of mushroom and exploring kind of what that looks like. Um, Also looking a little bit, and taking the science on its sort of edibility and culinary use a step further and putting some solid science behind that. It seems like there's been a general acceptance and we're starting to see field guides talk about how it can be prepared and made safe,
Yeah.
but there still seems to be a lot of kind of trepidation in I mean, science and the world is conservative in the sense that it's slow to adopt new ideas and let go of old ideas, even if the science supports the new ideas.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so we're just looking at ways to kind of further that discussion, I think.
Yeah.
So there's a couple things in the pipeline. It'll probably be um, hopefully some of the things will be published next year sometime.
Okay. Cool. Well, I just want to thank you for having this conversation because it's one of many that need to happen, just to illuminate some of the misconceptions around Amanita muscaria. I think that the more the more real, honest conversations we can have, the better equipped people can be, so that we don't have people ending up in hospitals. We don't have people having negative experiences. and hopefully we don't see regulation.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you again for this conversation. It's been really illuminating, and I'm sure the listeners enjoyed it too.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been fun, Michael.
All right. Talk to you soon, Kevin.
All right. Take care.